Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar, A Political Outlook and Policy Overview for the Tolling Industry. I'm Tanya Sharas, Vice President of Communications, Marketing, and Media Relations. Again, thanks for joining us today. Before introducing our panel, I'd like to go over a few logistics. This webinar will last 60 minutes. We encourage you to ask questions via the chat button at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to ask questions while it's fresh on your mind. Presenters will try to get to your questions throughout the event. And if we don't get to it then, we'll be addressing questions at the end of the presentations as well. We will be recording this presentation. It will be posted to the IBTTA website and YouTube following the session. So now let's meet today's panel. Dr. Kathryn Clay. IBTTA was thrilled to welcome Kathryn as Executive Director and CEO of IBTTA just last month. She's a seasoned association leader. She previously led the International Liquid Terminals Association, driving record growth and industry-first advocacy. With a PhD in applied physics from the University of Michigan, she applies a data-driven approach to infrastructure policy, drawing from leadership in energy, transportation, and public policy. Welcome, Kathryn. We also have Mark Muriello. Mark joined IBTTA in 2020 and serves as Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs, bringing extensive expertise in tolling, policy, and infrastructure management. A veteran transportation professional, he also has 3 decades of leadership experience at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, specializing in transportation, planning, traffic engineering, and operations. So again, welcome everybody to today's webinar. And Kathryn, you have the floor.
Great. Well, thank you, Tanya. And thank you to all the members that are with us on the call. It's really a delight to be part of this organization. And as Tanya mentioned, I'm still quite new and it has been the steep part of the learning curve, but I've been very excited to learn about the important issues that are facing this industry. And the purpose of our webinar today is to talk a little bit about the policy outlook, the view from Washington, and some of the issues that we will be working on, some that we need your guidance on, and a little bit about the political context that will define the art of the possible as we go forward. So for today's discussion, we're going to start out with looking at the new political landscape. Washington changes every time there's a new administration, and some administrations are bigger than others. Actually, let's go back a slide, Tanya. Or Kristen, thanks. We're also going to talk about surface transportation reauthorization, which is back in cycle. That current law is expiring September 30th of 2026. We'll talk about road use charging and related to that, the FSFA advisory board that IBTTA is represented on and has some good friends and supporters on that board as well. And then finally, we'll talk about one very high profile advocacy issue that we're engaging on, and that is the proposed reorganization of the lower 900 megahertz band. So with that, let's go on to the next slide. We're going to be talking about the new political landscape and what lies ahead under the Trump administration. So of course, no one knows exactly, right? This is a very early time in the new administration. It is typical, especially when there is a very significant change in the political philosophy of the outgoing and the incoming administration. It's normal for there to be some confusion on, or I shouldn't say confusion, might be too strong a word, but it shouldn't be a surprise that with something as big as running government, when there is a significant policy change, there are always going to be bumps in the road. And some of this we've seen with the Trump administration because they've dived in with such alacrity, wanting to make such changes on a large scale. So it should not be a surprise to anyone, given the scale and given the very different political philosophy of the Biden administration and the Trump administration, that there have been some needs for clarifications and changes in some of the directives. But it's already been a very busy time. It's been a very active first month of the new administration. And so in any sense, we're all trying to read the tea leaves at this point, but we do have some guidance we can look at from what's been done so far, and from some of the preparatory documents that were done during the transition or even prior to it from groups like the Heritage Foundation that were preparing for a conservative administration so that they could hit the ground running on January 20th. And so we're looking to look at some of the insights that we can glean from some of those sources. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah, great. We have new leadership at our Department of Transportation. The Honorable Sean Duffy, former congressman from Wisconsin, was confirmed by the U.S. Senate on January 28th of this year. We also are anticipating the confirmation of the Deputy Secretary at USDOT, Stephen Bradbury. His confirmation hearing is later this week on February 20th. He is a veteran of DOT leadership. He served in senior roles at DOT in the first Trump administration. And importantly, he helped author the DOT chapter in some of the Project 2025 documents. So if we go to the next slide. As I mentioned, there were some course corrections that were made in the last few weeks regarding pauses in outlay of funding across different agencies. And of course, that included the Department of Transportation. There were some questions that the new administration had in the very early days, and groups like AASHTO were able to reach out to the administration and educate them on what some of the programs actually did, emphasize places where they were consistent with administration priorities. And so those things are, it's very natural to have some transition issues. That's part of the process. And we're moving forward through those. Now, so some of the programs are still under review. If you take a look at the DOT website as I have, you see that some of the programs, the DOT website has, as you all know, plentiful information on the status of all of its programs, all of its grant making, all of the awardees. And you'll see on a number of these websites that there is a policy update that says as of February 7th or so that these programs are under review. There are some questions about whether even funding that has already been awarded, whether that might be drawn back. And there are questions about contract law and what the administration's legal options are. But make no mistake, they are looking for places to make economies. And every program is going under very thorough review to see how much it aligns with the new administration's direction that they would like to take the government. We already know, for example, that the EV charging programs, so the NEVI program, I believe a $5 billion program, is on indefinite hold. And I think that given the statements of the administration, that is likely to largely hold, although we are going to have to see if states press for existing contracts to be upheld. We also know that a lot of the programs are being reviewed to see if they are overly emphasizing things like climate change, programs that have multiple benefits may fare better. Programs that are looking at resilience rather than climate change per se may fare better in the internal reviews. But there is a lot of uncertainty right now about whether even currently appropriated programs will be able to get all of that money ultimately out the door. Again, this administration is very serious about making these cuts, and we will also be talking about what that means for surface transportation reauthorization as well. So if we go to the next slide. I wanted to take a moment and talk about our new leadership and our new partners to see what we might be able to understand about them and about what their priorities are based on where they've been before. And I'd love to start with Sean Duffy. Sean Duffy has been a longtime fiscal conservative. These quotes that I've included here are actually from his former congressional campaigns. Again, he's from a rural community in upstate Wisconsin. He said quite famously, I come from a long line of lumberjacks, and my family has a proud heritage of swinging the axe. And he indicated that even as a member of Congress, he wanted to swing that axe in Washington with regard to unnecessary spending. So he's obviously very well positioned now at leading a major agency to be able to execute those kind of economies. And he also is a believer in small government, government assisting the private sector largely by getting out of the way. And I think this quote speaks to that. I just believe that government borrowing and spending doesn't lead to economic prosperity, growth, or sustainable jobs. I know that it comes from the private sector, people who invest in their businesses and ideas. So that pro-business stance might be an opening for us on some of our policy objectives to emphasize ways that tolling and user fees and public-private partnerships could come to the fore and be a part of solutions. So Kristen, if we go to the next slide, and you can click again, yes. So very notable memo came out of the Secretary's office over at DOT. It's undated, but came out in early February. And that directs that all DOT funding, even current programs that are currently authorized and appropriated, that those programs should be prioritizing awardees that have the following attributes. So number one on that memo for the Secretary's list is utilizing user pay models. So that's a tremendous opening for us. Someone that is going into the discussion with a very pro posture for user pay models is something that we can use in all of our conversations. Other things that he has indicated his tenure at the Department of Transportation will emphasize is directing funding to local opportunity zones, giving preference to a different kind of demographic than we've seen in the past, giving preferences to communities with marriage and birth rates higher than the national average. Interestingly, the memo says communities, not states. So it's not clear at all what this would look like in terms of enforcement yet or in practice. And I think that that's natural, that it's early days and leaders have to put out a vision and then the implementation comes later. There are also signs, and this is included in the memo, that DOT is going to be very active in aligning with other administration priorities that we would normally associate with different departments, such as no DOT funding, the memo is a little ambiguous. It does not say that you can't get funding if your program includes support or assistance for vaccines or mask mandates. It just says priority should be given to programs that do not have those elements. And also priority should be given to programs that require local compliance with immigration enforcement. So let's go to the next slide. And I have a few excerpts here as we, again, trying to read the tea leaves about what is likely to come from the administration on the ground. What are the actual policies on the ground going to look like? And I've included a few excerpts from the Heritage Foundation's Mandate for Leadership, which is one of the documents that makes up what's loosely called the Project 2025 work. And it's important to note that these are not official Trump administration documents. They were published by the Heritage Foundation, which is a prominent DC-based conservative think tank. But it's worth noting because we know that influential people in the administration did contribute to this. And so it's one avenue for us to try to understand their thinking and where they want to take their time in government. We know, again, in particular, that the Deputy Secretary nominee, Stephen Bradbury, was a primary contributor to the transportation chapter. So we're looking for insights, but we don't want to overstate this because these are not official administration documents. All right, so going on, I had a few excerpts if we go to the next slide. Again, we see in the Mandate for Leadership, which is an outline for the new conservative administration's approach to DOT, the role of user fees and pricing innovations, including toll charges on roads and bridges. So we're seeing a real openness again to user fees, as we heard from, or as we saw in the DOT memo from Sean Duffy. We also see support for public-private partnerships. The report states P3s are an excellent tool for transferring risk from the public sector to the private sector and can create considerable value for the taxpaying public. Going to the next slide. They're also right on board with our approach to technology. Technology is not something the government should get involved in picking winners and losers. And in talking to Mark, I know that that's something that this association has long believed. And I think we will see support for that from this administration. The department should, it says in the mandate for leadership, the direction is the department should ensure a technology neutral approach to addressing any emerging transportation technology. Of course, keeping safety is the #1 priority. And I also thought it was worth noting that they particularly talk about autonomous vehicles, that they see that as an emerging issue that merited, the authors felt it merited bringing out special mention in the report. So thinking about smarter systems, innovative systems, that they won't be picking winners and losers, I think this is a good indication, but setting the goals and letting the private sector come up with the innovation to make that possible. So let's go to the next slide. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who has given some thought to the new Congress and what we can expect from some of the new members. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Kathryn, and greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Glad to see so many people. So the new Congress has, as all of you probably know, shifted. So both houses are now in Republican control. The margins are still very narrow. In the Senate, the margins are slightly higher than they were in the 118th Congress in favor of the Republicans, but still only a few key Republican votes basically tip the balance against any legislation. The thing to note with the new Congress is the number of first-time representatives in both houses. So in the House, we are looking at a balance currently of 217 Republicans to 215 Democrats. There are 3 vacancies still to be filled behind some administration changes there, as noted on this slide. But there are 32 new Republican freshmen, most of them with some form of tolling in their state. So we have people that are at least familiar with the form of tolling for funding and financing. Next slide, Kristen. On the Democratic side of the House, we have 34 new Democratic freshmen. Again, lots of tolling experience among the states they are representing. But these freshmen represent lots of opportunity for us to get in, to introduce who we are at IBTTA and what's important to us and you all as members. On the Senate side, next slide, Kristen. We have 14 new freshmen in the Senate, including 2 that were recently appointed after the election as successors to Senator Marco Rubio and Senator J.D. Vance, who are both now part of the administration. Again, lots of tolling, not lots of experience from tolled states among this class, but again, a lot of folks that we should be able to get into and talk to and introduce our point of views. I will note Ashley Moody, who is the recent appointment behind Marco Rubio, had taken a very active interest in the cyber phishing attacks interest in the state of Florida. So she's well versed in some of our issues moving forward. So next slide, Kristen. And we're going to turn over to surface transportation reauthorization now.
Yeah, great. So I'll make a few high-level comments and then turn it over to Mark to share quite an extensive list of of policy initiatives that IBTTA has considered in the past. And we'll talk a little bit about those and about how we might go forward in prioritizing our asks for the future for this next reauthorization. So just again, as a reminder, we're back with the new Congress back in session. We're diving into reauthorization, even though we have until September 30th of 2026. In some ways, that's just a blink of the eye away. Initial congressional hearings have already been announced, and many transportation groups. I attended the AASHTO Public Policy Committee Day and heard from a number of other like-minded groups as like-minded to IBTTA, and heard that they already have quite robust programs going on trying to determine their priorities for transportation reauthorization. So we'd like to start that kind of conversation within IBTTA. We're going to be working with, of course, the Government Affairs Committee and with the Board of Directors in putting together a process. I want to make sure that as we define our advocacy priorities, that all members feel heard and have a voice. And so we are looking at ways that we can do that, whether that might be member surveys or an additional committee or town hall process. Please stay tuned because we need you and we need your voice. And we want to make sure that the portfolio of top priorities that we settle on as an organization, we want to make sure that they are serving everyone. So keep that in mind as you look at the list. We're at the point now where we're trying to just bring everything together, all of the different ideas. And we will certainly, as you know, we're not multi-billion-dollar organization. We have to be nimble and strategic in our choices. But we want to start with all the good ideas that we can get on the table for our discussion. So I will say one more thing before turning it over to Mark, and that is we have a sense now of how tough it's going to be even to protect programs that are already authorized and appropriated. So the question is, how much more would we be able to fight for in terms of funding in the next round? And my sense is that getting up to the next passage of reauth, we're going to be doing a lot of work in just trying to protect existing programs that matter to you. So I don't think that we can make our eyes too big on what we're looking for in terms of dollars, but we can be strategic. And we can also look at ways where we can have legislative changes that allow more private sector participation. And that might be where we can really change the game in this next round. So with that, Mark, I will turn it back to you.
Thanks, Kathryn. So I'll just note also, even though the current law expires on September 30th, there is money in the Highway Trust Fund coffers to go beyond that date. So one option for Congress is to extend the program, which, as we know, has happened with prior federal legislative efforts. Knowing how the Trump administration and Congress are very anxious to move aggressively and quickly, that may not happen. It may very well be that Congress moves very expeditiously in both houses to put a bill together that can actually garner some action before the expiration of IIJA. So just kind of handicapping a little bit in terms of what might happen and how quickly it might happen, but it really points to the fact that 2025 is going to be an important year for us to make some points with Congress. Next slide, Kristen. So IBTTA has had some tried and true areas of federal program interests. We've always advocated for more permissive and less federal restrictions on tolling the interstate highway system. We've argued for more flexible approaches to the TIFIA loan program, and particularly making sure that maximum percentages of project costs are eligible for those loans. We've argued for more enhanced access to federal funding directly by toll operators and tolling organizations rather than as pass-throughs through their state departments of transportation. We've set our sights on better consumer privacy to help facilitate the transfer of toll and exchange of toll data among states, to help with interoperability of our electronic tolling systems. And then we've had some specific asks in some of our urbanized areas, on managed lanes and some specific language around eligibility of bus-related transit on managed lanes for transit funding allocations out of the federal program. Next slide, Kristen. In addition to that, we had identified when IIJA was first passed a few areas of specific legislative language that were concerning to us. A few of those were in the Congestion Relief Program, which is the program that allows tolling on the interstate highway for up to 10 urbanized areas in the US. And there were some provisions there that kind of spoke to the maximum toll allowable within the program, from the lowest class of vehicle to the highest class of vehicle, and then others kind of putting restrictions on state of residency discount policies. We really think at the federal level, they ought to back off and be a little bit more flexible to allow states and local areas to address their local needs and objectives as flexibly as possible. Federal requirements were also put in place for HOV and transit, either toll discounts or waivers on new toll facilities in IIJA. We'd like to see that also be a little bit more open and flexible. And then finally, there are provisions for over-the-road buses to benefit from the same rate as public transit buses on toll roads, which are not always in line with what local conditions and objectives are. Next slide, Kristen. Some of the areas we've talked about over the past 12 to 18 months with the IBTTA board and with the Government Affairs Committee center on some of these topics here. Resiliency, certainly, and making sure that critical infrastructure is well represented in terms of the risks and the threats we're managing against. Workforce is an issue for most transportation organizations. Toll operators are no different. So federal help with capacity building and training and development and more resources and flexibility to use various institutions is something where we've had interest in. Data information exchange standards and the ability to kind of progress those into broader and broader areas for mobile commercial transactions within vehicles is something that we have an interest in. With safety being such a high priority in IBTTA over the past year or two now, leveraging technology in terms of V2X, in terms of advanced next generation traffic management center software, and leveraging AI and machine learning into predictive analytics and operations support tools are really important. Lowering barriers to commercial activity on the interstate highway system. This speaks to restrictions for commercial activity on rest areas, as well as other commercial activities along the right-of-way of the interstate highway system, becomes more and more important as we look at more technology sophisticated infrastructure and the ability to commercialize those to help get them implemented and deployed. Infrastructure banks have been an area of interest among many of our members, as well as the toll credit marketplace program that was included in IIJ that hasn't been acted upon, but this allows states to transfer and sell unused toll credits to states that are interested in having them, and it creates a win-win in terms of revenue for both sides. And then highway cost allocation, and there are others as well. So there are many others, and this is where Kathryn is saying we'd really like your input as we go forward in terms of what some of the priorities are agency by agency. Next slide. So with that, I guess I'll keep rolling, Kathryn. So the federal system funding alternatives, next slide, and the status of the advisory board. So this was the provision in IIJA that called for a board to be appointed to basically assist in designing a national motor vehicle per mile user fee pilot program. So a pilot program at a national level, including all 50 states and Puerto Rico, for all vehicle types and all roadways. The members of this board were announced finally in January of 2025, and their responsibilities are to recommend the structure, scope, and methodology of the pilot, to importantly assist with some public awareness and communications of the need for this type of measure, to support the analyses that the pilot will need to assess what they're learning, and then to participate in making some recommendations and forming a report to Congress. Next slide. So these are the members. They were designated in the legislation as 15 different seats. The toll operators and owners of toll facilities were one of those 15. We advocated for Andrew Vermeer from the Bay Area in California to be the toll representative, and that was accepted. So Andy is one of the board members. But I'm pleased to say that we have some great representation. Other IBTTA members have seats on this board, including Oregon DOT and WSP and the Washington State Transportation Commission as IBTTA members. And the board's chair, Carlos Braceras, from Utah Department of Transportation. And then we have some good friends of tolling and of IBTTA that are also seated on this board, including the Eastern Transportation Coalition. Trish Hendren is in the role of vice chair. And we also have AMVA, Marcy Coleman, who's been working very closely and cooperatively with us as a seat. So we have some great perspective on what our industry's issues are as this moves forward.
Great. Well, I'll jump in here for this slide. I wanted to point out that Sean Duffy's confirmation hearing before the Senate Commerce Committee, which was on January 15th, he got a question from one of the senators regarding the revenue gaps in the Highway Trust Fund. And he clearly was well briefed on the issue, and his response I thought was interesting. He said, I think there are three scenarios talked about. You can increase the gas tax. Made very clear that was not where he would go in terms of policy. And then he said we could increase tolling, or there's a mile-driven formula that could be used as well. So great that he had openness to that. I noted my ears pricked up when I saw this. My concern with that, though, is the privacy around the American citizens. So it's not clear whether his privacy concern is tolling or the mile-driven formula or both, but it might be a clue for us on approaching him to be mindful that we need to address privacy concerns in our education for the secretary and his lieutenants on that. So just thought that was interesting. That actually came up in a question in the hearing, and good insight there. And I'll turn back to Mark for the next.
And you could just roll on to the next one. So on road usage charging, the states have had kind of a long history now of pilots and research that they've been doing to look into these issues. The national pilot gives us an opportunity to delve into some issues that may not have been as well covered or investigated in the state programs as they need to be. Privacy is certainly one of those issues that Kathryn was just talking about. Some of the others are enforcement and compliance, the administrative costs and cost of collection, how we achieve interstate reciprocity, particularly for out-of-state drivers within any state, and then looking at the means of leveraging all the data available in the vehicles today would certainly give us another cost-effective option to reporting mileage. And then very importantly, it's beginning to look at how we structure requirements. Kathryn talked about a technology neutral and technology agnostic approach to innovation and technical advances in our industry. And this is very important that we establish requirements for our business outcomes and our technical outcomes and the functional outcomes we need, and not necessarily to specify a specific technology or technological approach. And then certification of kind of the processes and equipment we use is a very important step. And then clearinghouse functions and account management options to ensure that there's lots of flexibility for lots of different service providers to enter this field. Some of the policy issues are going to be focused around revenue and the financial interests and net revenue in particular. There's lots of people that view road usage charges as an option, as a policy option to achieve a lot of different things: congestion management, air quality objectives, and social and income equity. If we pull too many levers at once, we're never going to get out of the starting block. And what's most important to keep our eye on here is that we have a financial issue in that the gas tax revenue is not sustainable and the highway trust fund is insolvent, and we need to do something to fix the revenue problem. We need to focus on creating a true value proposition here and not focus on just kind of easy participation incentives to get people interested in the programs. And then we need to really think hard about how national rate setting might take place. And then, very importantly, because the pilot won't be complete by the end of the IIJA legislation, is what do we need in the next round of federal authorization and in federal law to help facilitate this solution in moving forward into the next 5 years. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kathryn.
Great. And Kristen, we can go to the next slide. Perfect. All right. So our last policy issue to present to you today is the NextNav petition, which would propose to reorganize the lower 900 megahertz band, which is currently used, of course, for tolling uses. Let's go to the next slide. To give you a sense of the state of play and what has occurred in this front, it started last April 16th. NextNav petitioned the FCC to reconfigure the 902 to 928 segment of the band to enable an expansion of NextNav's positioning, navigation, and timing network, or PNT network, as these are called. So NextNav already operates a PNT network, although it's in a smaller part of the spectrum. And they are also not the only game in town when it comes to a PNT network. Now, why the policy interest in these networks? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that these networks have the promise of being able to give not just X and Y, but Z, so vertical dimension for first responders. So the idea would be if you're in a 14-story building, not only would the PNT system be able to give you the coordinates as GPS would of where on the surface that building is located, but it would be able to tell you, okay, the EMTs need to respond to a distress call on the 8th floor, right? So there's a clear public good in PNT services that provide that. The other major public good that NextNav is proposing to provide is to be a supplement or a backup to GPS systems. And they point to the tremendous economic value of GPS, our dependence on GPS systems. And their argument is that they deserve a concession from the government. They are very proud that they're not asking for funding, but a concession from the government in terms of spectrum to support them. And of course, we push back on this by pointing out that, yes, that spectrum may not actually be in hard currency, but it has an economic value of about $2 billion. And so the NextNav petition, in essence, is asking for a $2 billion or so indirect subsidy to support its systems. So a lot of fairness and equity issues there. But what has transpired since April is that the FCC signaled that it was taking the petition more seriously by opening up a comment period last August. And in September, during the comment period, IBTTA formally opposed the proposal, given the likely significant disruptions to tolling systems that would result from needing to move the part of the spectrum in which tolling operations are currently operating, and also to condense the total amount of spectrum down to a smaller, I think it's a total of 11 megahertz that NextNav would propose that we would all fit into. And really at the center of NextNav's petition is this contention that the 902 to 928 portion of the band is, in their words, is largely underutilized. So part of our argument has been to go back and point out that we are utilizing that spectrum, and that it is not cost-free for us to either relocate the spectrum position for operations or to consolidate into a much smaller portion of the band. Now, we have been looking at coalition building, and very importantly, IBTTA, I'm very, very proud of this part of the effort. The tolling coalition that we have put together reached out to another group called the Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation. And this is the trade group that represents PNT providers. So NextNav and its like groups, except NextNav is not a member of this trade association. So being brought up to speed on the fact that NextNav was attempting to sort of lock in its predominance as the government selected PNT provider, we were able to persuade the RNTF to become involved. They put together a paper that explained that there are many alternative methods out there, and there are alternatives to enhancing the nation's PNT capabilities without reallocating the 900 megahertz spectrum. So we have a lot of work underway. I'm going to turn it over to Mark to talk a little bit about some of the threads that we have going. Very importantly, we're doing some technical studies. The manufacturers of the transponders are looking at how each of them can quantify the effects of interference, at least on a coarse-grained scale, to be able to make the point to the FCC and others. And Neology is moving forward, I think, first on the testing, but we're hopeful that the others will initiate testing as well. And that's going to be critical to demonstrate that our systems will be affected. It's tough because, in theory, the burden of proof is on the new applicant. So we should not have to do this testing. It should be NextNav having the presumption that they have to do testing to show that they would not have interference. However, this is such a tremendous issue for us. We really feel that we need to have our own data. And so we've been operating on that presumption and trying to move as quickly as we can to get some solid data. Also to share with IBTTA members to get a little bit more concrete in what we're talking about as the effect on systems. So let's go to the next slide. And before I turn it back to Mark, just as I did for the Department of Transportation, I wanted to spend a moment talking about the new leadership on spectrum policy. So Brendan Carr is the chairman of the FCC. He's a longtime FCC official, nominated by both Trump and Biden, well-respected. His priorities actually include telehealth and skilled workforce. It's always good to know what people, and I'm taking this from his bio. He actually prioritizes these so much that he puts them in his bio. So for skilled workforce, maybe that's something we can find common cause with him. Ariel Roth was just recently appointed the head of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. I'll note NextNav is actually on the advisory committee for NTIA. Ms. Roth is a former advisor for Senator Ted Cruz, did his telecom policy. She also is a former staffer working with Brendan Carr at the FCC. And her priorities include reforming the broadband expansion program that was in the IIJA. So let's go to the next slide. And I think this is our slide where we go into more. Oh, there's one more. Yep, one more before I turn it over to Mark. Maybe actually, sorry, there's one, this slide and the following. I thought it was interesting to then see in the mandate for leadership. Again, we're looking to read the tea leaves and just looking for clues on the thought processes that the new leadership might have. But going back to DOT and the new deputy secretary coming in, who was one of the authors again of this. And I noted that there were a couple of excerpts in the transportation chapter regarding spectrum. So first of all, this direct quote, there's a role for DOT in ensuring that in the fight over spectrum, transportation gets its fair share. And Mark has pointed out that this could cut both ways. This could be PNT, could be considered a part of transportation as a priority. And it also could be our issues with maintaining our operations. What I still continue to be encouraged by this quote, though, is that it says that DOT sees itself as a player. And so sees itself as having a role to weigh in with FCC, that we're not going to run into officials at DOT saying, look, this just isn't our issue, this is an FCC issue, and we don't play there. I think that this indicates we're likely to get the leadership at DOT to believe that they have an appropriate role weighing in. And that goes to the next slide. So Kristen, and that is that they particularly looked at another instance back in 2020 when the FCC reallocated some of the spectrum that was used for transportation programs for transportation safety and ITS. And it very clearly was indicating that spectrum should be returned, that spectrum should be used for the kind of purposes, not just PNT, but the kind of purposes for more traditional transportation safety and communications, and I think tolling would fit in that as well. So I think there's an opening there to engage DOT on our fight on NextNav. And now let's go to the next slide. And now Mark will walk us through some of the particulars.
Yeah, and I'll just note, just following up on the points Kathryn just made, is that US DOT is the lead federal agency on GPS supplementation and augmentation. So they're going to be an important player here. So as we look at our outreach and advocacy, we need to kind of reach to those organizations in the federal system that are going to be influential in terms of the decision making. And first and foremost, that's going to be the FCC and US DOT. And then kind of probably next in the pecking order is Congress. So we need to kind of keep all three of those kind of in our high priority list for outreach and advocacy. So along those lines, IBTTA has stepped up to kind of put some organization to a toll coalition opposition to this whole proposal by NextNav. We have an oversight group that is comprised of representatives from IBTTA's members in terms of toll operators and the toll system and technology firms, as well as our respective legal and regulatory councils and some of our outreach and communications and legislative affairs people. This group is taking the lead in finalizing an economic impact analysis that also includes a lot of legal rebuttal to much of what NextNav has been putting out since the public comment period closed in terms of their own public relations and communications campaign. One of those pieces was an economic impact analysis that NextNav produced by the Brattle Group. And this piece that we're finalizing now will be a rebuttal to that piece of work. We also have a technical and engineering working group that Kathryn mentioned, largely comprised of the major tag manufacturers, roadside reader manufacturers, system integrators that are the technological experts in this field. They have collaborated on a test plan that begins with some lab and kind of bench tests in a laboratory type environment to begin with, that they will each be working on, and that we will consolidate into some initial findings and outcomes, and then look to see what needs to be done to take some of the worst case scenarios and maybe bring them into a field testing environment. We have a legal policy and advocacy working group that's looking at all the regulatory and legal arguments to counter the petition, including all the outreach I was talking about with federal and state officials, all the regulators and the public policy makers, primarily focusing first on the FCC, USDOT, and key congressional committees. And then we have a media and public relations group that's going to look to drive some of the media and communication efforts so we can be nimble and fast to respond to the many efforts that NextNav is making to make claims to support their solution and their point of view. And then we're also working with various coalitions. Kathryn pointed out one in terms of the Resiliency Network Coalition. In addition to those folks, we've been working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and have had some good success in 3 separate FCC engagements where tolling was kind of the lead presenter among 5 different use cases that we talked to FCC decision makers about, and we hope to do more of that in other coalition settings as we move forward. And with that, I think that brings us to the end, Kathryn.
I think so. Let's just make sure. Kristen, is that our last slide before questions? And we have a question in the chat. Great. I'll speak to the question in the chat. So thank you for this really insightful question. And we don't know who MCAT is, but I'm glad you're here.
Michael from the Illinois Tollway.
Oh, fantastic! Great. Well, thank you for the really thoughtful question. Yes, and in fact, it's an interesting legal question. There is a requirement that the FCC is not supposed to allocate spectrum that would have economic value to others. So their authority requires them, and I'm going to say require, although it turns out legally it's a little bit soft, but it encourages, maybe I should say encourages the FCC to have a public auction rather than assign valuable spectrum to a single petitioner. However, it turns out that although it is not supposed to do that, according to its authority strictly, that they have done that before when they find that it's in the public interest, and there are some other kind of caveats to it. But I think it is something we can push back on. So it's certainly a lever that we can push, and I think that it doesn't look very good in the media to say that the FCC, especially under Trump, that is trying to be business friendly and fair-minded towards business interests. I think that it would be a compelling argument to them that, look, this is a valuable commodity and it should not be just assigned to one group. So I think that's a very fair point. I think also the other point that you bring out, that it's not just about our systems today, but it's about the transportation systems of tomorrow and how those are going to evolve. And if we don't provide spectrum to allow those uses to grow, if we forestall those potential opportunities for growth by reallocating that spectrum, we only diminish the future of our transportation networks. So I completely agree. I think very well said. And those are 2 arguments we need to bring in. We're going to need every argument that we can bring to bear. This is going to be tough. NextNav is a very well-funded, well-connected player. But I've said this to many board members and others that I know that they have deep pockets. I know that they're politically connected, but if you were to show me their arguments and our arguments and ask me which side I would want to fight, I would want to fight our side. I think the arguments are with us. We have the stronger, logical, moral, uh, ethical, fair-minded business efficiency approach. And I think that that is going to count for quite a bit.
And I would just like to also kind of just respond to Michael's thought about future-oriented technologies and GPS and road usage charging. I mean, that's exactly right. The meeting we did with US DOT back in early November, the federal highway representative pointed to exactly that these PNT systems may be the future of road use charging on a national level. And we recognize that and understand that, but we also think there are other places where these systems can be developed that don't impact transportation uses today in the lower 900 megahertz and give the lead time to kind of make those transitions, which we know are going to be decades in the making. So we need a useful, reliable, and an accurate system that we can count on until we're ready to springboard to these next generation of technologies.
Very well said, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you both. We still have a few minutes if anybody has any additional questions to put in the chat. We also had one question come in, Mark and Kathryn, on permitting reform and any insight that you might have on streamlining under the Trump administration as a priority.
Oh, that's an excellent point. Yes. Yes. And I was remiss to not include that specifically. Thank you for bringing it up. I think absolutely. I think this is exactly the kind of political moment when we can get traction on that. I think the administration would look at that favorably. And I think that, there are ways that we could do it. Again, I was at the AASHTO meeting a couple of weeks ago, and they were looking at things like if there's a categorical exclusion for one agency, by changing the statute so that other agencies can use a categorical exclusion that was established by another agency, so that you don't have to start over again with every single agency. That you can streamline it by having one agency make that determination. So I think that's one way. I think absolutely. We should put our heads together and figure out what are the ways that we would like to streamline, because it's one thing to say, please streamline NEPA, but the more specific we can be in direction, in specifically what are we asking the agencies to do or to not do, the more successful we can be. If we could come up with specific legislative language, and again, I'm sure that we would be working with coalitions of other transportation organizations, and with NEPA, maybe even broader than that. I think that is exactly the kind of winnable scenario that we should be focusing on.
And I'll just note, we're going to be keeping a careful eye on Congress on these issues as well. The Senate Environment and Public Works Committee later this week is having a hearing specifically on environmental permitting and streamlining that we'll be watching carefully this week. So, lots of discussion here, kind of at all levels of government.
Yeah.
Excellent. We have one more question coming in from Lev Pinellas. He asks, is there any way to estimate when the administration's approach towards tolling and RUC may be further clarified? What might be opportunities as well as risks based on how their policies are forecasted to impact tolling?
Well, let's see. I'll start, and then I'll turn over to Mark to talk a little bit about maybe an indicator for when RUC might move would be what's going on with the advisory board, Mark, so that think about maybe responding with that. I think we really need to go in and talk to the transportation leadership to get an answer to that, Lev. I think that we've seen some good indicators that they would be open to opening things up for user fees such as tolling. And I think again, the more specific we could be, if there are legislative changes that we could propose, I think this is not usually the case, but I think this time around, it might actually be easier to get legislative statutory language changes than to get authorization of funding. And that is not usually the case. But I think the more that we can look for places statutorily where we could make language changes to allow tolling to have a more prominent role, that's where we can have some wins. But to your point, when would we know? I think we don't know until we go in and we talk to them. And I think that we should be doing that in the next couple of months. And I would say stay tuned.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Kathryn. And I would say that our opportunity is now, that the devil is going to be in the details here. And the level of granularity we can bring to some of our suggestions will be very helpful in an environment that's probably going to be supportive. We have a Congress and administration that's looking to reduce federal funding and yet prioritizes infrastructure and infrastructure investments as a key part of growing the economy. It's our opportunity now to kind of come up with these programs and proposals that talk about substantively what the federal government could be doing to support new sources of revenue, and that includes tolling, certainly. On road use charging, I think the jury is still out. I think there's so many unanswered questions there that we probably have a longer lead time. Given the fact that this advisory board is a discretionary portion of the federal legislation, it's on pause right now. And it remains to be seen whether the administration will unpause it to allow them to start their work. And I think they're going to do some careful deliberations about the utility of taking this on now or waiting until the next legislative round is better defined.
Thank you, Mark. All right, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you to our panelists, Mark and Kathryn. We'll be posting the presentation on the website as well as on YouTube. Also want to encourage everybody to please join us in person in Texas for our annual technology summit. You can register at IBTTA.org and check out the full calendar for 2025. So thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the webinar and have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.